Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Linscomb. I'm with the USA Rice Federation, and I would like to welcome you to the Mississippi Rice Research and Outlook Report. We'll have two presenters today, Jeffrey Mansour, who is a graduate student, soon to be a PhD at the Delta Research and Extension Center in Stoneville, and Dr. Brian Mills, who is also at Stoneville, who is a research ag economist. So I think everyone is aware that this is a very different way of presenting this information this year. These reports would be made during the Rice Outlook Conference, which would have been held this year right about now in Austin, Texas. And because of circumstances, we were not able to have an in-person Rice Outlook conference, but we did feel that these reports were important enough to make this information available to the rice industry. In a way, having them presented virtually actually allows us to maybe get this information to more people because a lot of people that would not typically attend the Outlook conference will have the ability to look at the reports here today as well. These reports are being recorded and will be made available on the USA Rice YouTube channel probably early to mid next week. So that being said, again, our first presenter today is Jeffrey. He's been doing quite a bit of work on his PhD project on trying to improve fertilizer efficiency in Mississippi rice. He also has done research on other row crops common in the Delta of Mississippi. So with that, Jeffrey, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Linscomb. I appreciate it. As you said, it's unfortunate that we cannot be in Austin, Texas this year. This is one of the meetings that I look forward to every year, being able to meet with everybody in the rice industry and learn about new things. I do want to point out that Dr. Golden wants me to send his regrets. He has accepted a new opportunity with J.R. Simplot. He'll be the East Territory Manager for technical services representatives in the U.S. So I'll just give us kind of a general brief overview for the Mississippi Rice research that we've done. And just to kind of go ahead right off the bat, I mean, 2020 has been the epitome of Murphy's Law. And anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And I mean, for the most part, it has gone wrong in Mississippi rice production. You know, starting out with the environmental conditions, we had large amounts of rainfall events early in the season that helped, you know, some mild temperatures that delayed our planting. Then we get through the growing season, things are kind of looking up, and then it was hurricane after hurricane after hurricane. And I just want to point out that this website link right here down at the bottom, we actually did a collaboration, Dr. Golden and I, with Dr. Dustin Harrell from Louisiana State University and the USDA. We put together a hurricane preparation, recovery, and assessment program pamphlet. If you go to this website, it gives you other links for disaster aid. It'll give you kind of a checklist, things for producers to maybe think of prior to arrival of hurricanes, what they can do after a hurricane event.
Hey, Jeffrey, let me interrupt you here. Have you shared your screen? Because we're not seeing it.
Let me make sure. Can you see it now?
We can. You might want to go to presentation view.
How's that look?
Perfect.
Sorry about that. So again, in this website link right here, you can go through. It's not just predominant for Mississippi or Louisiana. There's multiple states in there. It gives you kind of checklists, things that you can do prior to, maybe things to consider if you're still harvesting rice, or what to do if your rice seems to be damaged, and things of that nature. And then obviously for 2020, we have the COVID-19 pandemic. And it basically, early on in the year, it just kind of left us with the question of where do we go and what do we do? You know, there was kind of that decision on, it was early in the year, it's already raining. Producers were, you know, not so sure how they were going to get their seed for planting. If they were going to get the seed, were they going to be able to get the chemical? And then if you got that, what were you going to do about fertilizer? And it was so uncertain because of the logistics of how we were going to manage the supply and the demand. So we didn't really know what to do. And I don't think it was necessarily a question that anybody could have answered, other than just, we had to be patient. We had to wait it out. We just kind of had to see where it was going to go. And I mean, fortunately, it definitely turned out for us. So if you'll look here for the 2020 planting progress, the red bar shows our 2020 planting progress, and the maroon bar shows the previous year from 2019. Our circle dotted line is our 5-year average, and our dashed line is our 10-year average. And you can see pretty much throughout 2020, we were well below the 2019 planting progress. And then once we hit about that May 3rd date, we jumped to a significant portion of our planting. I mean, we jumped well over 30%. And, you know, a lot of that was, of course, again, related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Then you had all the high rainfall events. But still, some of the research that was done early on by Dr. Tim Walker and Dr. Bobby Golden was assessing like late planting dates for rice. And essentially what they found is that day 120 on the Julian calendar, which is marked here by this black line, this is only for 2022, by the way, that shows any day after 120 on the Julian calendar, producers could expect to lose 0.25% bushels per day after day 120 from their cropping history. And what's significant about this is, if you'll see right here, about April 29th was that day 120, and then we started hitting that spike in our planting on May 3rd. So for a while, we were kind of unsure how a significant portion of our yields were going to turn out throughout the state. So that was one of those things we just kind of had to wait for. We didn't really know what we were going to expect. But if you look at our acreage trends, you can kind of see, you know, we're still down from that 2016 average, but we've been bouncing back a little bit on 2020. And, you know, we were right at about 171,000 acres. And we're expecting, you know, at least 30 to 35% increase next year in those acres to be row rice or furrow irrigated rice. You know, in 2020, we were right around roughly 30,000 acres in furrow irrigated rice. But a lot of those acreages are definitely going to be dependent on how soybean commodity prices reflect on that. Right now, I know there's been some increasing on those prices, so that'll definitely affect how we go forward with 2021. But as I mentioned previously, you know, with our yields, we didn't really know how it was going to turn out being later planted. We expected that things were going to be okay through the growing season. Everything kind of calmed down for a little bit. And what we actually saw is based on all the calls from Dr. Golden and USDA surveys, we're anticipating to be able to set a state record yield at about, we're going to be right around 165.5 bushels, 165 to 166 bushels. You know, and with that, we also haven't received very many calls regarding milling quality or things of that nature. So what we're presuming is that usually when we receive those calls, we expect poor milling qualities. People are wondering what they did, how they can go forward to prevent this from happening. So we're anticipating that overall for the state of Mississippi, everything looks pretty good. And now I'll just kind of jump into some of the things that we are kind of doing in our program a little bit. This research is conducted by one of Dr. Golden's master's students, a colleague of mine, Will Eubank. And we always get these calls every year about replant decisions once you just have a full stand of rice. And essentially, if you'll look at the photo on the left, you can kind of see how there's these nice little gaps, these holes in some of these plots where the stands were thin. You don't necessarily know what to do. And so what we did is we took a hybrid selection and inbred selection. We planted them at the recommended seeding rates, and we decreased them all the way down to, reduced those seeding rates down to 25%. We used the variety, the XL745 and the Clearfield 153 variety, and averaged over 2 years of data. What we've noticed is that even if you get down to that 14 pounds for hybrid and 36 pounds for the inbred, we don't necessarily see much of a yield reduction when we reduce our seeding rates by 50%. So then that can kind of suggest that even if you do have a poor stand establishment, you're later in that year, it may not be to your advantage to completely kill that stand and have to start all the way over, especially if field conditions are already tough as it is. Another thing that we like to do is our variety by nitrogen screening program. Of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we couldn't include as many varieties as we normally would like to this year. However, we were very fortunate to get some of the more popular varieties that our Mississippi producers prefer. And essentially, this study was conducted on silt loam soil. We just increased our nitrogen rates by 40 pounds per acre using just standard urea. And as for the most part, even when you look at that CLX 4197 hybrid compared to all the other inbred, except for that CLL17 variety, about 160 pound rate is right around that time where we tap out and reach maximum yield potential. And the same trend follows for our Provisia lines, the PBL02 and the PBL01 trends as well. So that was something that we've also done. Now, just kind of an update from Dr. Tom Allen, our rice pathologist at Mississippi State. The leaf blast continues to be a disease of limited no yield reduction. Now, I want to point out that in this slide, this is pertaining to flood rice, like flooded rice. This is not for a row rice setting or furrow irrigated rice. I know that in recent past, we've noticed that in row rice, we do see blast. We do know that that pathogen can be devastating to yields. Some folks are starting to pick it up now in the delayed flood rice production systems. And because they see the yield reductions associated with row rice, they start to get concerned, want to make these fungicide applications. And it's important to note that Dr. Allen has done ample amounts of research and shown that there is no yield reduction associated with it in delayed flood rice production. And of course, we do know that in 2018, we had our first detection of a QOI, or our Strobularian class fungicides, resistant to Rhizoctonium solani, or sheep blight as it is more commonly known. So in that field, the producer made 2 applications of a single QOI-based fungicide. We isolated that fungus, screened it, and tested it for resistance, found out that it was resistant to the Strobularian class fungicide. However, this is only one per farm in Mississippi. It was in continuous rice for approximately 5 years. We still do monitor that field. We are still going out and screening for fungicide failures whenever they are perceived to happen. And as far as we can tell, we have not seen the spread or have observed any kind of QOI resistance on any additional acres. Now, one way to manage the sheep blight resistance is obviously hybrid rice has a higher or better disease package than the conventional inbred varieties. And there's also the ability to rotate the corn or soybeans. And I also want to point out that you can also use alternative fungicide modes of actions. But I do want to point out that you need to be careful. There are multiple products with different names, but they all contain the same active ingredient. So be aware of that and make sure that you're rotating from your Strobularians to alternative, maybe a DMI or an SDHI class fungicide, and also be able to try to implement, dual modes of action. So you can still apply that Strobularian fungicide, but it could provide better fungicide efficacy if you use that strobilurin plus a triazole or DMI class fungicide as well. And as you can see on this picture at the bottom right-hand corner, you can see those water-soaked lesions, chestnut coloring, and you see the white hyphae. And if you pull that canopy back, you can see the telltale diagnostic signs of sheath blight. You can see those little bitty, kind of like specks of dirt. Those are the sclerotia from Rhizoctonia solani. And once you've reached the point of this, it's very hard to control something like that with a fungicide. And transitioning into some research from Dr. Jeff Gore, analyzing stink bugs in furrow irrigated rice versus flooded rice. We've had several calls about folks going out, doing sweeps in rice late in the afternoon. They're coming back, say a week or so later, checking again, and they're noticing an abnormal amount of damage associated with rice stink bugs, but they're not obtaining the numbers that they've been sampling. We noticed it was becoming more common in rotor rice, and then we also noticed that there was some concern over pyrethroid control failures. So Dr. Gore threw in this kind of preliminary test right here. These rotor rice and flooded rice, this is a CL153, they were planted side by side on the same day. And what he noticed is that sampling times early in the morning showed larger amounts of rice stink bugs than when sweeps were conducted later in the afternoon. But it was different for flooded rice, and that didn't necessarily matter. And essentially what was going on is in that row rice scenario, these stink bugs are able to move down to the crown of the plant where it makes it harder for consultants or producers to go out there with their sweep nets and find those numbers. And it's also, this is going to help with, or increase the amount of control failures we see because we're not directly getting those pyrethroids to that stink bug. So when sampling in row rice, it's important to note that sampling in the mornings and making those applications in the mornings are an advantage versus later in the afternoon for row rice scenarios. Now, switching over to our rice irrigation from Dr. Drew Golson. Dr. Golson's taken some preliminary data right here, and what he's done is he's conducted automation irrigation. He did this on a producer's field in 3 locations in Bolivar County. The grower just basically managed his fields using normal water management procedures. We collected the yield data through the yield monitors. And what we saw with the automated system was that there was a 9.2 acre-inch reduction in water use and a 4.5 bushel increase in yield associated with automated irrigation and sensor technology. So now there's going to have to be further research from Dr. Golson to see whether this type of procedure is advantageous to all producers, as well as what kind of economic benefits this is going to provide for them as well. And here's just an image to kind of help you see what is going on. You'll notice over here at the top where this is an electric well, you have your telemetric device that serves as your main hub. That main hub is working off of your ultrasonic water level sensors that you can see on the right and your left side. These sensors are placed about 2 inches into the soil profile. Whenever moisture content drops below field capacity, you can see that it will trigger it back to the main hub. That main hub will turn on the pumps. The telemetric devices right here by the valves or the pipes will open up that actuated valve, flow that water out to that sensor to deliver the proper amount of water that it needs. Then that actuated valve, that sensor will hit that water level mark, send it back to your main hub, shut that actuated valve off. And if you need to water the other side, it will actually send it back, open it, and close that actuated valve as needed to irrigate either one or both sides of that field. And this is just kind of to wrap all that up. It's really interesting because now it provides a main hub using an internet service that our producers can utilize from their telephone to tablet. They can see when they're irrigating, how often they're irrigating. They can make sure that they're maintaining soil moisture levels throughout the soil profile. And they can see it and store all this information on the PIC server. And it just shows you how all these things are kind of tying in and talking to one another. But again, as I said, Dr. Golson's going to continue to analyze and determine whether there could be some kind of an economic advantage to this as well. And, you know, this is probably one of the more common things that we get from Mississippi. Early paraquat exposure. You know, early in the year, it's always coinciding we get these calls. Producers have already planted their rice, they're finally getting the stands, and then it's not uncommon to see in Mississippi, you have a field of rice separated by one turn row and a field of soybeans. So these soybean farmers are going in, they're trying to get that burn down in, and it's not uncommon that they get this drip rate occurrence. So some of the research that was conducted by Dr. Ben Lawrence assessed early paraquat exposure across multiple timings. And what he found is that there was a positive trend in delaying maturity when rice was exposed to paraquat so many days after emergence. And how that correlated to yield is that we saw an inverse relationship and a negative trend over here on this right side graph, that yield decreased as you got exposed to paraquat later into the season. And basically what that amounted to is that rice maturity was delayed by 1.9 days for each week after emergence that exposure occurred. And in addition to that, rice yield reductions were 2.6 bushels per acre for each day after emergence that exposure occurred. So now it led us to, well, what happens in the late paraquat exposure when you get into harvest aids and producers are using paraquat as a desiccant for soybeans. This research conducted by Dr. Justin McCoy showed that the days after 50% heading, even a sublethal concentration up to 21 days after heading, which would be at the time that a producer is about to draw their field down from flooding, you can see that there's kind of this exponential curve of where you're still losing yields. And essentially what that led us down to was that rice yield reductions were greater than 12% following exposure up to 21 days after 50% heading, which is that time when you're pulling flood, draining your field. So it's important that most people, when they see this, they think, oh, that rice is done. You kind of get careless with your spraying, you may drift a little bit, and you don't think, oh, you'll never notice. Well, our data shows that that's not necessarily true. Well, then after we got done with that, it kind of led us to the next question of, well, what happens if you get single and multiple paraquat exposures? And so this research is being conducted by Ms. Tamika Sanders, who is a graduate student colleague of mine pursuing her PhD under Dr. Jason Bond. And essentially what she did is she assessed single and multiple exposure times starting from 50% heading, draining, combination of those, very early post, multiple timings, mid post, multiple timings. And again, these were all done at sublethal concentration rate of 10%. So what I want to point out here is that everything that was an early exposure event would have been about 4.8 ounces to the acre. That would be the sublethal concentration at 10%. Then anything from later on, late in the season, that would be a 1.6 ounce per acre rate to get that sublethal concentration at 10% as well. And you can see that within visual ratings, 7, 14, 21 days after application, there are some significant differences. The most notable is the very early post plus that draining time when you get hit with multiple paraquat exposures. And as you can see, these ratings revealed the highest levels of paraquat phytotoxicity. And then you look at how that translates into yield on your far right column. When no exposure to paraquat happened, rice yields were in the 150 bushels per acre range. Going down to that very early post plus that draining time, we see that rice yields were reduced to 120 bushels per acre. So that's a 30 bushel difference in the amount of yield that's being lost because of multiple exposures, versus at the very early post, you still lose about 20 bushels per acre. And then at that drain time, we did not see any yield reduction associated with that. And I think further research that will be conducted from Ms. Tamika will figure out whether or not that trend will hold true or not. So now we have to answer the question. As I said earlier, we're expecting this significant increase in the amount of per irrigated rice So we kind of have to begin this research of figuring out, well, things like weed control, disease control, insect control. So what one of my other graduate student colleagues, Mr. Jay Seal, who's conducting his PhD under Dr. Jason Bond, is doing is examining the effects of clomazone applied in post-application studies, post-emergent studies. What he did is he applied clomazone in early post, the 2 to 3 leaf timing, or 14 days after early post. He also applied at mid-post or the 14 days after mid-post to determine how or when to control barnyard grass to obtain greater than or equal to 95%. So now, as you can see in the top picture on the right side of the screen, this photo was when clomazone was applied pre, followed by propanil plus quinchloronate at the early post timing. And then we saw that barnyard grass control was not at that 95% level where we wanted it to be. So he came back 14 days later with an application of pendimethalin plus clomazone plus bispyrate sodium. And you can see now how clean that row is right there compared to the bottom where you can see the barnyard grass and in the non-treated control, you can see that now we have multiple tillers in this barnyard grass. We're going to have to implement multiple applications, multiple modes of chemistries. And so that in turn is going to, really hit you economically, and it can also impact your yields as well. And then furthermore, we wanted to assess the timings of those applications for barnyard grass control as well and for irrigated rice. So what we see here is this photo was taken 35 days after emergence. On the far left, you have your non-treated control, and you can see the amount of barnyard grass in there. Then at 14 days after emergence, we applied imazeptide plus quinclorac, and then we still did not obtain that 95% control again, as I said. So we followed that up with an application of clomazone plus propanil. Now, at that 14 days after application, we can see that when we made that initial application, we were able to clean it up, even though we had to do a sequential application. But when we made 21 days after application with just imazeptide plus quinclorac, you can see the amount of barnyard grass, a lot more weed pressure than in the photo in the middle. And I would like to point out that this photo was taken, so right now at this timing, Mr. Seal was going to come back with an application of clomazone plus propanil right when he took this photo. So once we get from grass control, we move over to analyzing broadleaf control, more specifically Palmer amaranth. Just similar to the other previous study, we wanted to determine, if we delay these herbicide applications, how is that going to impact weed pressure and yield? And also, how is that going to impact what we need to do going forward with sequential applications? So in this middle photo right here, propanil plus thiobencarb at 14 days after emergence, when the photo was taken 35 days after emergence, shows that there's great control. You can see very little barnyard grass. The residual from that thiobencarb is holding it up. But if we delayed that application by at least 1 week, you can see that now you have some of these pigweeds popping up. And at this point, that's going to require another application to follow that up, to be able to control those pigweeds. So I think further research from Mr. Seal is going to really kind of drive home of how important it is to make these timely herbicide applications and what kind of benefits you can gain from using some of these residual products as well. And we also get the call every year, how do I maintain my yields? What can I expect to get? What's the best procedure? And we're still a long ways away from being able to figure all that information out. But what we wanted to do is start out right here, analyzing an ESN, which is a polymer-coated, slow-release nitrogen source, versus just standard urea at 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre, applied at the 3 to 4 leaf growth stage in rice, and that was the only application we made. So now the benefit of the ESN is that you get that slug-release end source. It lasts throughout the growing season, or it lasts probably throughout the majority of the growing season, but you're not getting as much nitrogen losses associated with ammonia volatilization or nitrification / denitrification which are two of the most prominent end losses that are associated with row rice production. And looking at the pictures, you can tell that the ESN, the photo right here, you can see that there's a good color to that rice. The heads are starting to really pop out, that rice doesn't look stressed, versus the urea application where it was all applied at once. All of that urea was broken down and converted into ammonium. You can expect the majority of that was going to be lost through ammonia volatilization, as well as nitrification/denitrification in those furrows. So now we moved into how does that translate into yields? And very similar to the previous picture, we just took two different nitrogen rates of 120 pounds of N per acre and 200 pounds of N per acre, applied them at that 3 to 4 leaf stage. And what you can see is that we added some enhanced efficiency fertilizer additives, NBPT, which is one of the most popular urease enzyme inhibitors that is impregnated onto urea for rice producers to reduce the amount of ammonia volatilization associated with nitrogen losses, as well as another particular product that we're evaluating, which is nitropyrin. This is a nitrification inhibitor that targets that nitrous somonas bacteria in the soil to try to prevent it from converting that nitrites to nitrates, which is lost through gaseous losses or leaching in the soil, with ESN and a combination of a urease plus a nitrification inhibitor. And again, this is just preliminary data. We see that there's not much of a yield, no statistical differences in yield associated with any kind of a product. But I think now what this tells us is we need to analyze whether we can split these applications up, where we need to see how to break this field down into zones, doing nitrogen rates with these enhanced efficiency fertilizer additives, to be able to get this information to our producers so that we can know how to manage that nitrogen without getting these yield losses. And one little portion that I've done with my dissertation and research is analyzing cumulative N losses associated with ammonia volatilization. And essentially what I've done in this study is this is a laboratory incubator study. I took a specific weight of soil, put it into a jar, established a moisture content of 20% based on the weight of that soil, put it into an incubator at 76 degrees Fahrenheit temperature to try to simulate supersaturated field conditions at high temperatures that are most prominent for ammonia volatilization. And as you can see on this cumulative percentage of N losses, urea, which is your squares, can be 3 weeks after application can be up to 35%. And now it's not uncommon for most of our producers to establish a uniform permanent flood even 7 to 10 days after they make that urea application to try to establish that flood. But one of the interesting things to note is if you look at these triangles with the nitropyrin or nitrification inhibitor, at 14 days after application, we're seeing higher percentage of cumulative N losses all the way up to 21 days after application. So this suggests that using nitrification inhibitors may not necessarily be an economic advantage because you're losing more of your nitrogen through ammonia volatilization by trying to prevent nitrification or denitrification. And then you can see that with the NBPT containing products and the combination of nitropyrin plus NBPT, you don't see much of a benefit in reducing the amount of N losses, nitrogen losses. So that tells me right there that it may not be an economic advantage for producers to essentially take these fertilizer stabilizers in a dual mode of action. It may not pay off for a return on investment, even though it's still just as effective as a single mode of action as well. And just kind of wrap it up back to the epitome of 2020. I convinced one of my friends who was getting into row rice to do one of these enriched strips, because the question always comes up: what's it going to take to hit that 200 mark? What do I need to do? How much do I need to apply? So we performed an enriched strip, and basically, I can't even remember which hurricane it was because I gave up once they hit the Greek alphabet. You can see that high levels of nitrogen applied to the field right down the center of that picture. That was our enriched strip. It laid that rice completely flat on the ground. And that was right at the soft dose stage. So we're definitely going to have to go back and do some more research conducting to figure out what is our proper nitrogen rates, and that every time you can apply as much as you want, but it may not always work out to your advantage as well. And to wrap that up, here is some of the data from Dr. Ed Redonia, our Mississippi State rice breeder, who conducts all of our rice variety trials. He did 7 locations this year across the Delta. He had 36 entries, and breaking it down to average yields, Dr. Redonia obtained some exceptionally high yields from the hybrids, our Clearfield, Provisia varieties, and our conventional varieties. The highest yielding entries from our hybrids was our Rice Tech 7301. From our Clearfield or Provisia lines, it is the RU 2004191, which, if I'm not mistaken, this is Mississippi State's next variety. I believe it's coming through the pipeline that will be available to our growers soon. And then for the conventional side, that variety is Thad. If our producers would like to, you can simply go to this website link I've provided here at the bottom. This breaks down all the entries and all the locations, so you can see all the varieties, what they yielded, how they were in terms of milling quality, lodging, things of that nature too as well. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions anybody has.
So one question, Jeffrey, relates to multiple applications of clomazone. With some discussion about clomazone resistance, the question is it really wise putting out multiple applications in row rice?
I'm sorry, Dr. Linscomb, you kind of broke up on me. Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, the question is about the discussion about clomazone resistance developing. Is it really wise putting out multiple applications of clomazone in row rice?
So that's a good question. With the development of clomazone resistance, if you're going to do that secondary post application, you need to be sure that you're obtaining whether or not you're going to be able to obtain that 95% control. And also, if you do those multiple applications, it would definitely be to your advantage to implement or rotate your crops and take out that herbicide chemistry as well.
Very good. Thank you, Jeffrey. That was excellent. We're going to shift gears now and talk about outlook in Mississippi rice. And Dr. Brian Mills is an assistant professor in agricultural economics, and his areas of responsibility are in farm management and policy. So Brian, we're going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Happy to be here. Get this shared real quick. So as Steve said, my name is Brian Mills. I'm an ag economist. I'm at the Delta Research and Extension Center in Stoneville, Mississippi. Today, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Mississippi rice outlook. We're going to look at some recent trends in crop acreage and prices. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the enterprise budget projections Mississippi State puts out every year. And then I'll talk a little bit about the Title I programs for rice and how that's shaping up. And then lastly, just a comparison of enterprise budgets. We'll look at rice, corn, and soybeans and how those compare on the returns for each one of those. So this year we had a pretty big increase in acres compared to last year. We ended up with the FSA certified about 164. So our largest acres since 2016. We're a little bit about 40,000 acres more. I've seen that go up this year. And you can kind of see it's about 50,000 what we ended up increasing in acreage compared to the last year, 2019. We saw corn and cotton acres go down quite a bit. A lot of that was spring planting season. Couldn't get the crops in, so they switched sort of to soybeans, which with prices that ended up being okay with soybean prices kind of rallying finally at the end of the year. So we did see sort of a kind of a big change in acres from 2019 to 2020. And so in Mississippi, all the rice acres are pretty much, or they are all in the northwest part of the state in the Mississippi Delta region. As you can see, 2019 to 2020, all the counties that grew rice, I think, increased acres. Oliver was the most in 2020 with over 43,000 acres in rice. So you can kind of see this the increase and how that changed here in Mississippi, in that sort of Delta region. So prices, price for rice, that's like the green line there. In 2019, it was up a little bit from 2018. 2020, looking like that marketing year average. Right now, it's projected to be a little bit lower than this year, but still a little bit better than it has been in the past. But going forward, let's see what rice prices will do. And so these Title I farm programs, which are the Agricultural Risk Coverage County, this is ARC County program, and then the Price Loss Coverage program. Producers were able to choose between these at the beginning of this year. They able to choose for the 2019 and 2020 growing seasons. There's also ARC individual coverage, but that really doesn't really pay for most situations. I think in the South Delta, if there was 100% prevented planting, you kind of saw ARC individual coverage was the better option down there. For the most case, this ARC County and PLC are your two main programs. They can make this decision again here in 2021. I think it's the spring of this next year. The PLC program, it does help protect against low commodity prices. And then your ARC County, it helps you against revenue losses at the county level. So I'm mostly just going to talk about the price loss coverage program. So this PLC payment rate for this program is based on the marketing year average price in relation to the reference price. So if the marketing year average price is below the reference price, there's a payment. And this marketing year average is just the national average price received by producers over the marketing year, and it's dependent on when producers sell the most. So it's from August to July, but it's prorated on when producers are more likely to sell. And so the estimated PLC payment per base acre, you take that payment rate by your farm's PLC yield, and then you multiply it by the 85% reduction factor, and that gives you your payment per base acre. And so in 2019, what we saw for rice, long grain, we got about a reference price around $6.31, and that finalized marketing year average price was $5.41. So we got a payment rate of 90 cents, which then you multiply that by your farm's PLC and then by 0.85. So it ended up being a pretty good payment for 2019 for both long grain and short grain, especially compared to what payments were for corn and soybeans. For 2020, this sort of just projected right now. I guess one thing that the 2019 is, these are finalized. So this is the payment rates, and those payments should be coming out soon. 2020, so this again is from August, the marketing year of August to next July. So right now, that projected marketing year average price for long grain rice is at $5.27. So it's a little lower than this last year. Price is supposed to be expected to go down for that, and then from the medium short grain expected to be a little bit higher. So PLC payment for long grain will be a little bit higher, but for medium short grain it's going to be a little bit lower right now. This can change quite a bit, and it probably will change quite a bit before these are finalized next year. This kind of gives you an idea of where those prices are sort of headed right now. And so this PLC, it did have a little bit higher payments than the ARC County in 2019. And it most likely will in 2020, just given where that reference price level is, and that those historical prices. I mean, that reference price, it's, I think historically rice hasn't been above that price only 3 times in the last 20 years. So it's very likely that you'll see payments for that PLC. So I mean, going forward, PLC is definitely a very viable option. And then producers are going to be able again to make that choice again here in the spring. Moving on. So every year, Mississippi State puts out our annual enterprise and planning budgets. We do this for different rice production systems. We do it for conventional hybrid, Clearfield. Now, used to be Clearfield hybrid. It's now full page hybrid, and then Provisia. So these budgets are cost estimates. We do a lot of surveys throughout the year, different companies, surveying different production costs, and as well as fixed costs. So on your equipment, depreciation, and all that is factored in there as well to give sort of a per acre cost and revenue for all these different production types. And so for rice, we have contour, flood, straight levee, multi-inlet, and then the zero grade system. The cost for all those, and sort of our projected revenue. Now, producers are very likely to use different practices in their own operations, and nobody's going to be, no two farmers are going to have the same cost. This is sort of just gives an idea of what these costs are, and what the expectation of these will be going forward, and sort of like just an estimate of those. So when when a producer is looking at these, they should accurately like change what they're actually doing, just to give an idea of to determine their own costs. These are all available at the agecon.msstate.edu website under the budget tab. And we put these out every year. So compared to last year, there wasn't really a large change from the 2020 budgets. I think it was about a 2% difference in cost. The big change is Clearfield Hybrid is now full page. And then for fungicide, we have changed from Stratego is now Flint Extra and Tilt are in place of that. But overall, really, it was a slight decrease in cost. A lot of that was due to fixed costs. We have lower interest rates, so we saw fixed costs kind of drop. Large decrease in diesel costs too. So herbicide was a little bit up, not a whole lot compared to those other ones. So we did see just a slight decrease in our projections for next year. So here's our conventional. You can see there's the 4 different irrigation production systems. This is the conventional budget. So contour levee has the highest cost compared to, say, a straight levee zero grade. That $755 an acre, where the straight levee is $679. Fixed costs are a little less for the contour levee, but overall the expenses are a little bit higher. And since we don't really have a budgeted in a different yield expectation for those, what you see is that the contour levee is going to have a little bit higher break even. And given what prices are right now, what they're expected to be for the next year, around that I think it's $5.10. Right now, really only the straight levee rice is breaking even. But again, costs can be different, and there can be ways to reduce costs or maybe have higher yields than that. That would change that break even price. So the conventional hybrid, a little bit more expensive than the conventional. Hybrid's a little bit more expensive seed costs, but the yields are a little bit higher too. So again, the break even for this one a little bit lower. Just like the conventional though, the contour levy, a little bit higher break-even price. But for this one, all these are below $5. So given prices now, these are all expected to break even in the next year. Now the Clearfield budget, this one have really high cost. With the 160 bushel budgeted yield, we're looking at a really high break-even price. Definitely, if costs are going to have to, some costs are going to have to be reduced there, or find some way to increase some yields in order for those to break even in the next year. Then full page. This used to be the Clearfield hybrid. This one again, the expenses are really high on this one just because of a lot of that's in seed cost. But the break even is around what prices are expected to be for next year. So we're projecting it to be about break even for those. And then lastly, our Provisia costs here, they're a little bit lower than last year, but they're still a little bit high. And our yields, we didn't have any changes in our yields. The break even again is going to be a lot higher than what projected prices are right now. So that's definitely something going forward. Good to understand where that break even is, where you're going forward, and what costs maybe you can cut for some of these. And then this is
Brian, let me interrupt you here before you get off the budgets. We did have a question whether or not there will be row rice budgets going forward.
yeah, we will go. We're hopefully get those put together in the maybe next year. Hopefully we'll have it. But yeah, we just didn't this year with everything going on. We didn't have that put together this year. But hopefully next year we'll have that row rice in there.
Great, thanks.
Oh, okay. So this is sort of a tool that I put together based on something that Dr. Falconer and Dr. Walker had done a couple years ago. But this the newest one isn't up on the website right now, but this allows you to compare any of our budgets, or the margins between any of our budgets, and sort of see whether or not it pays or not. And do sort of a comparison of the returns. And I know I got a lot of calls like this spring when you have late planning of what you should, whether you should switch or not. And this is kind of to help with that. If you're looking at, well, should I switch? Should I not? And so, first example, this is just comparing conventional hybrid rice, flood irrigated, to soybeans. So on this little table, you can kind of see everything in white is where it pays more to grow rice in that situation. So essentially, if you're growing 180 bushel rice, and you know that if you switch to soybeans, you're only gonna get 55 bushel, you'd make more money just staying with rice. So it kind of just shows how competitive it is across different yield expectations. And whether or not you should switch in that situation. This is something you can look at when you're trying to make those sort of decisions. And so this is core, and you can see compared to soybeans, competitiveness of rice to corn is a little bit lower. Corn pays in most of these situations. That's not to say that that's how it'll be for every farmer. A lot of situations, it just depends on their costs and what they can, how much it costs them to grow something to do these comparisons. But just because this does give you an idea sort of how our budgets are laid out, and the competitiveness between those two crops. So in conclusion, rice acreage was up quite a bit in Mississippi in 2020. PLC is definitely a viable option for rice production going forward. We did have some small changes in costs in our budget projections, and only about 2% change. And then rice production is competitive with soybeans, but not as competitive with corn. But again, that depends on every farmer's situation. Going to be a little bit different. So that concludes what I was going to talk about. So if there's any questions, be happy to take them.
So if anybody would have any additional questions, just go to the Q&A box below. But Brian and Jeffrey, I just wanted to share with you that in the chat box, we had several very positive comments about both of your presentations. So again, you both did excellent jobs. I think we might have a question coming in. We do, and I guess, Brian, what are your expectations for rice acreage in 2021 in Mississippi?
I would assume that it's not going to go up very much. I would just, my view is that this will probably be about as high as we get. Just given what soybean prices are doing right now. I mean, soybean prices are above $10. Corn's around $4. Expectation for next year. So I would assume that we would either stay level of where we are with rice acres, or maybe go down a little bit. That just based off what those other crops prices are doing.
So we got an additional question. Did your comparisons between rice and soybeans and rice and corn include government support?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. So no, these didn't. I thought about including them, but the thing about like PLC and ARC is it's based off base acres, and so if you're deciding between corn and soybeans, the base acres are already set on that, or rice, and so it shouldn't really affect your decision on what you're going to grow, just because you're going to get that base acre payment. It doesn't depend on what you're growing. So when you're making that decision, if I'm going to grow rice or if I'm going to grow soybeans, I'm still getting that base acre payment of, say, rice. And so I didn't include it in that. And that's especially since, I mean, rice, we have a lot more base acres in rice than we do planted acres. So you have a lot of the situation where in the Delta, you have people growing corn or soybeans with base acres in rice. So I didn't want to have that be factored into the cost comparison.
Well, very good. Again, great job, both Brian and Jeffrey today. We do appreciate everyone's participation in our virtual presentations today. Wish we could have been with everybody at the Outlook conference, but maybe next year. I do want to make everyone aware that we will have the Missouri report tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Central Time, and the Texas report tomorrow following that at 10 a.m. Central Time. And again, with that, thank you very much for being with us here today. And we're going to close the meeting. Thank you.
I think there might have been one more question.
Yes, correct. If you counted government support, would that help rice acreage?
I don't know, because I don't think that the base acres don't really reflect what's going on in the planted acres. We have 300,000 more base acres and planted acres. So I don't really think that unless they change the base acres, it shouldn't affect the planted acres.
Okay, thank you again to our presenters as well as our participants, and hopefully we'll see you on the 3 presentations we got left.